blood-soaked earth, Normandy. The first thing I remember is the smell. Not the gunpowder, not the damp sea air rolling in from the beaches of Normandy, but the thick, suffocating stench of blood and earth fused together. It clung to my uniform, to my skin, to the very fabric of my soul. And the screams. Jesus, the screams. They were everywhere, crawling into my ears, burrowing into my skull, filling the space where rational thought used to be. The war had a sound, and it wasn't the rhythmic thunder of artillery or the rattling staccato of machine guns. It was the human voice, raw and broken, begging for mercy in a place that had none to give. I was a doctor. That was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to mean I saved lives. But here, in the makeshift field hospital set up in the ruins of a bombed-out French farmhouse, my job felt more like playing God with a loaded dice. You lived, you died. The rules didn't make sense. A boy with half his face missing would cling to life for hours, while another with just a small wound in his gut would slip away in minutes. Nothing was fair. Nothing was predictable. Nothing was human anymore. The first one they carried in that night was a private from the 82nd. His name didn't matter. None of them did after a while. His chest was torn open, his ribs poking out like broken piano keys, and yet he was still breathing. I knelt beside him, my fingers slipping on the slickness of his blood, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. His eyes locked onto mine, wild and frantic. He wasn't asking for help. He was asking for a reason. A reason why this was happening. A reason why he had to die in a field on foreign soil. His last breath wasted on a scream no one could hear over chaos. There were no reasons. I pressed the morphine into his arm, whispering something, though I don't remember what. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a lie. Maybe just empty words strung together in the hope that they would mean something to him. His body relaxed, his pupils dilated, and then he was gone. Another name I'd never remember. Another life swallowed by the war. Behind me, someone shouted. The next wave was coming. They kept coming. Always coming. The earth was drinking deep that night. They dragged them in by the dozens, bodies slick with blood, uniforms torn, faces frozen in expressions of agony or shock. The farmhouse we converted into a field hospital stank of sweat, iron, and something worse, something like rotting meat left too long in the sun. I didn't have time to think about it. My hands worked on their own, stitching, cutting, pressing, injecting. The human body is just a machine when you break it down, and I was a mechanic in the middle of an assembly line of death. Someone shoved a young corporal onto my table. His leg was gone below the knee, the wound hastily wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. His skin was paper white, lips cracked. He lost too much blood already. I looked up at the nurse beside me, Betsy or maybe Lucy, I couldn't remember anymore. She met my eyes and shook her head. There weren't enough transfusion supplies. We had to make choices. I stared at the kid, at the way his chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His fingers twitched against the fabric of the stretcher, grasping at something only he could see. Maybe home. Maybe his mother's hand. I pressed the morphine needle into his arm. Doc, someone called, voice hoarse. Incoming. I turned, my hands already moving, already reaching for the next body. But when they brought him in, I froze. He was still conscious, eyes glassy, but aware, scanning the room like he recognized something. Dark hair, sharp features, a familiar curve of the jaw. It took me a second to place him, and when I did, my stomach twisted into a knot so tight I thought I might be sick. Danny Case. We'd gone to medical school together in Chicago. Laughed over bad coffee in the hospital cafeteria. Pulled all-nighters studying, swearing we'd never do anything as stupid as join the damn army. And yet here we were. His uniform was soaked through with blood, his abdomen wrapped in a field dressing that wasn't doing a damn thing to stop the bleeding. His breathing was labored, uneven. When his gaze found mine, something flickered there. Recognition, relief, and then fear. I pressed a hand to his wound, felt the warmth of his life spilling out between my fingers. It was bad. Too bad. Hey, Tom, he rasped, voice barely a whisper. Guess. I didn't make the right career choice, huh? I swallowed hard, forcing a weak smile. Still better than accounting. His lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was pain. I should have moved faster. should have done something. But for the first time since the landings, my hands wouldn't work. My mind wouldn't process. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to Danny. Not to the kid who once patched up my busted lip after I mouthed off to the wrong guy outside a bar. Not to the guy who had more talent in his pinky finger than half the doctors in our class combined. His fingers curled weakly around my wrist. "Don't let me go like this, Tom." I knew what he was asking. I wasn't sure I could do it. I hesitated. And then someone screamed, high-pitched, raw. It tore through the room like a gunshot. One of the new arrivals thrashing on the floor, his intestines spilling from a jagged wound in his stomach. I had to make a choice. Danny or the soldier screaming for his life. There wasn't time for both. Danny's grip tightened, his eyes pleading. The soldier wailed. I made my choice, and I never forgave myself for it. The night dragged on, an endless cycle of blood and desperation, of choices that weren't choices at all, only calculations of who had a chance and who didn't. There was no room for hesitation, no space for grief, no time to mourn the ones who slipped through my fingers, even when they had names I once knew, even when they had stories that deserved to be told. The bodies came in waves, some barely breathing, some already gone, their eyes frozen open as if still searching for something in the flickering candlelight of our makeshift hospital. Danny had stopped breathing 5 minutes after I let go of his wrist, 5 minutes that felt like an eternity and a blink at the same time. I hadn't been there for his last breath. I'd been elbow deep in another man's body, trying to hold in what was left of his insides, trying to keep his heart beating for just one more second, trying to stop death with nothing but my hands and a handful of instruments that felt useless in the face of so much carnage. And when I finally looked back, when I finally had a second to breathe, Danny was gone. Not screaming, not thrashing, not even afraid anymore. Just still. Just another name that no one would remember except me. I didn't have time to say goodbye. I barely had time to pull a sheet over his face before the next stretcher was shoved into my hands. A lieutenant this time, one eye missing, the socket a dark, gaping hole, his face slick with blood and mud and something else, something that smelled like the ocean and rot and the end of the world. He was still conscious, mumbling something under his breath, a prayer maybe, or a plea, or just nonsense born from shock and pain. I didn't ask. I didn't need to know. I pressed my hands to his wound and worked, stitching, cutting, sealing, moving like a machine because that's what this place made us, because that's what we had to become if we wanted to survive the war without losing our minds completely. Outside, the shelling hadn't stopped. The walls shook with every explosion, dust raining down from the rafters, the flickering lanterns swaying as if the farmhouse itself was trying to decide whether to collapse under the weight of the war. I could hear the distant screams from the beach, from the trenches, from the bodies still out there in the dark, waiting for someone to find him, waiting for a miracle that wouldn't come. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and for a brief, terrifying second, I thought we were all going to be buried alive under the rubble, entombed here with the dead and dying, another forgotten corner of a war that had already claimed too much. But the building held, and we kept working. And the night dragged on. At some point, hours, maybe days later, time had lost all meaning. I stepped outside for a breath of air that didn't taste like blood. The sky was a dull shade of gray, the kind of color that didn't belong to night or morning, just some endless in-between, a limbo where the dead waited for the living to catch up. Smoke curled over the trees in the distance, the scent of burning flesh still thick, the echoes of gunfire a constant reminder that the battle wasn't over, that it would never be over, not really, not for those of us who had seen what I had seen, done what I had done. I should have gone back inside. There were still men on the tables, still bodies that needed saving, still more names waiting to be forgotten. But I couldn't move. I stood there, staring out at the ruined landscape, at the torn-up fields and the craters where homes used to be, at the stretch of land that would never be the same again, soaked in too much blood, filled with too many ghosts. And then I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a cruel joke played by my exhausted mind. But he was there, standing at the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of the lantern glow. His uniform was still stained, his face still pale, his dark hair hanging in damp strands over his forehead. But his eyes were open, and they were locked onto mine. Danny, I knew it wasn't possible. I knew he was dead. I had seen his body go cold, had pulled the sheet over his face with my own hands, had felt the weight of his absence settle in my chest like a stone. But he was there, standing in the mist, watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something caught between sorrow and understanding, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared, my breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The mist swallowed him whole, the field empty once more, the night stretching on as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew, deep down, that I would never stop seeing him. Because some ghosts never leave you. Some ghosts stay, walking the same blood-soaked earth, lingering in the places where they fell, waiting for the ones they left behind to finally understand the weight of their choices. And as I turned back toward the farmhouse, as I stepped into the chaos once more, as the next broken body was pushed into my hands, I realized that I would never leave this place either. Not really, because the war didn't just take lives. It kept them. Forever. It was the end of the battle, but not the end of the war. Not for me. Not for those who survived. We had won the day. So said the commanders. So wrote the reports that came to us over the noise of explosions and the cries of the wounded. The Normandy landings were successful. The front was moving forward. The enemy was retreating. But how do you explain this to those we were pulling from the battlefield in pieces? How do you explain this to a boy holding his own severed arm, not realizing that he would never be able to hug his mother again? How do you explain this to yourself when you find yourself among the bodies you saved yesterday, and today they lie in a row, covered with old blankets, and even those who remained alive are no longer the same as before? I worked until my hands began to shake, until my eyes were sticky with fatigue, until my own mind refused to believe that all this was real. Finally, someone pulled me aside, pressed a flask of something strong into my hands, and I drank it without even thinking about what it was. The alcohol burned my throat, but it didn't change anything. The blood was still on my hands. The voices of the dead still rang in my ears. Somewhere in the corner of the room, someone was crying quietly. One of the orderlies, a young guy who had laughed at jokes and smoked cheap cigarettes just a few days before, now sat with his head pressed against his knees, his shoulders shaking as if he couldn't hold it in any longer. I looked at him and realized that I probably should have said something. I was older. I had experience. But what could I tell him? That it would all end? What would be better? That death was just part of war. I was silent. The night slipped into morning, gray and cold, with no hint of sun. The battle moved on, and with it the screams, the explosions, and the smell of gunpowder. The field was littered with bodies. The soldiers began to collect the dead, loading them into cars that would take them back to the rear to nowhere. I went out into the courtyard, breathing in the air that no longer smelled of fire, but was still heavy, filled with something invisible and dark. Somewhere nearby, I could hear a foreign language, French peasants, timidly returning to their broken homes, looking at us with distrust, as if at ghosts. Ghosts. I felt it again. At first, just a feeling, as if something cold had touched my skin. Then a shadow, barely visible at the edge of my vision. I turned my head sharply until my head was spinning, but there was no one there. Only the tracks of our boots in the mud, only the ruins, only the broken road leading south. And yet, I knew he was there. Danny. He is gone from the living, but he is not gone. He stands somewhere out there in the shadows among the others who have stayed here forever. Maybe he is waiting for me. Or maybe he is reminding me of the choice I have made. I don't know which is worse. My war is not over yet, and I don't think it ever will be. A land soaked in blood never lets go of its own.